His Excellency, Honourable Alex Chernoff, the Governor of Victoria and the patron of the Australia-India Institute, Mrs. Chernoff, Her Excellency, the High Commissioner of India in Australia, Mrs. Sujata Singh, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, the Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, Elizabeth Alexander, Robert Johansson, Chairman of the Board of the Australia-India Institute and Deputy Chancellor, University of Melbourne, Professor Glyn Davis, Vice-Chancellor, University of Melbourne, Professor Susan Elliott, Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne and Deputy Chair of the Board of the Australia-India Institute, the Honourable Consul General of India in Melbourne, Dr. Subhakant Behera and Mrs. Behera, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am Amitabh Mattu, Inaugural Director of the Australia-India Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to the Australia-India Institute's annual oration. This is the second annual oration of the Australia-India Institute. The first one, some of you will remember, was held in April 2010 and was delivered by the Honourable Minister for Human Resource Development of the Government of India, Mr. Kapil Sibal. We are delighted and honoured to have His Excellency Alex Chernoff chairing this oration. And we are delighted that Dr. Shashi Tharoor, celebrated author, human rights activist, member of the Indian Parliament, will deliver this year's oration on Indian soft power in a globalizing world. The oration, many of you know, follows the Institute's inaugural conference, The Reluctant Superpower, Understanding India and Its Aspirations, which was the biggest conference on India in Australia in recent years. May I now request His Excellency, the Governor, Alex Chernoff, to introduce our speaker for this evening's oration.
The Honourable Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Mrs. Sunanda Tharoor, Mr. Robert Johansson, the Chairman of the Australia-India Institute, Professor Mattu, the many other distinguished guests whom Professor Mattu has read out, and you will not mind not reading it out, reading your names out, otherwise we'll be here for a long time, and friends and colleagues. I'm delighted to be able to join you this evening in such distinguished company. And I can't really believe that 12 months have passed since I had the pleasure of hosting Australia-India Institute's inaugural lecture delivered, as the Director has mentioned, by Kapil Sibal. Unsurprisingly, it was an outstanding success. And the past 12 months have been very busy for the Institute, particularly since the appointment of Professor Mattu as Director in April of this year. Under his leadership, the Institute is continually increasing its program and expanding its network to deal with broader cross-sections of interest to the two countries. It's a credit to the Institute that it has fitted this important oration in its annual calendar. As with last year, this year's speaker is of the highest calibre, and we are honoured and privileged that he has accepted the invitation to address us this evening. Dr. Shashi Tharoor's career to date has spanned a variety of roles, from author to peacekeeper, refugee worker and human rights activist, former Indian Minister of State for External Affairs and now a member of the Indian Parliament. Educated in India and the United States, he was awarded his PhD as well as the prize for Best Student in 1978. Following this, he commenced nearly a 30-year stretch with the United Nations. This hands-on and direct experience has equipped him with knowledge, expertise, compassion and empathy. Dr. Tharoor has nurtured these qualities, and through his award-winning books and articles and other activities has endeavoured to communicate and educate the wider public on issues of globalisation and human rights. On an international level, Dr. Tharoor has been a key player in disseminating information about India's impressive transformation and future prospects, India's culture and the country's present and potential influence in world politics. He is therefore most qualified to deliver this evening's oration, which is entitled Indian Soft Power in a Globalising World. And so it is with much pleasure that I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to join me in welcoming Dr. Tharoor to deliver the 2011 Institute Annual Oration.
Governor Chennault, thank you for that very gracious and I must say very generous introduction. Chairman Johansson, Professor Mattu, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I really am very pleased to have this opportunity to address you all in the footsteps of my good friend Kapil Sibal, but this time on a subject that I've spent a little bit of time thinking about, that of the soft power of India. I've been doing that because of late the focus in our country and around the world when one talks about India. Even the theme of the conference that Professor Mattu organized till a few days ago, the reluctant superpower. This focus has been, perhaps in my view, excessively on India's rising power in conventional terms, our consistent economic growth in the last couple of decades, the potential of India to have a term like superpower, reluctant or otherwise, applied to it. The frequent references to India as a future world leader. In fact, the American publishers of my 2007 book, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, even added a gratuitous subtitle suggesting that my volume was about the emerging 21st century power. I must say I'm troubled by that notion and by that term. I'm not sure that we can yet speak of being a superpower when we are still super poor. We have a lot of internal problems to overcome. The notion of world leadership in any case is a curiously archaic one. The very phrase is redolent of Kipling ballads and James Bondian adventures. What makes a country a world leader? If it's population, we're on course to top the charts. We will overtake China as the world's most populous country. The official UN statistic had said 2034. It now seems we will actually pip them to the post in 2026. Is it military strength? Well, India's is already the world's fourth largest army. Is it nuclear capacity? Well, India's status was made clear in 1998 and then formally recognized in the Indo-US nuclear deal. Is it economic development? Well, there, of course, we know that India has made extraordinary strides in recent years. It's already the world's fifth largest economy in PPP, purchasing power parity terms, and it continues to climb. And in fact, the most recent figure last week from the IMF suggests that in PPP terms, India will actually become the second largest economy. China, I beg your pardon, the third largest economy, second in Asia behind China, because we are likely to overtake Japan by March of 2012. For the ones who are obsessed with exactitude, the reason for this is that Japan's GDP is 4.07 trillion. I beg your pardon, 4.3 trillion. India's is 1.3, but when you convert it into PPP terms, that comes to 4.07 trillion. Japan, sadly, after the tsunami and Fukushima, will not grow this fiscal year at all, might even shrink. India will grow. The government estimates 7.2%. The IMF somewhat more optimistically estimates in excess of 8%. At either figure, then India's 4.7 will exceed Japan's 4.3. So, potentially the third largest economy in the world after the US and China in PPP terms. Yet, as I said, too many of our people still live destitute amidst despair and disrepair. So what is it? Which of these various elements are we to rely upon in speaking of India as a superpower? That's why I hesitate to use that word. But what I'm happy to talk about is something that in some ways combines all of these elements, but is allied to something altogether more difficult to define. It's soft power. Now, what is then soft power? I think many of you, especially in a university setting, are familiar with the work of my good friend Joseph Nye at Harvard, who came up with the term just under 2 decades ago, a decade and a half ago. he coined the term, really in his first evocation of it, to describe the extraordinary strengths of the United States, which went well beyond American military dominance. Nye argued that power is, after all, the ability to alter the behavior of others to get what you want. And there are three ways to do that. There's coercion, sticks, there's inducements, carrots, and there's attraction, soft power. If you are able to attract others, you can economize on the sticks and the carrots. Now, traditionally, therefore, power in world politics was seen in terms of military power, right? I mean, the side with the larger army was almost always likely to win, right up to the 20th century. But in the recent decades, the last few decades of the 20th century, this no longer proved to be enough. After all, the US lost the Vietnam War. The Soviet Union was defeated in Afghanistan. And even in the 21st century, after the fall of Baghdad in 2003, the United States arguably discovered in its first few years there the wisdom of Talleyrand's adage that the one thing you cannot do with a bayonet is to sit on it. So in this context, enter soft power, both as an alternative to hard power and as a complement to it. Let me quote Nye's exact words. "The soft power of a country rests primarily on three resources," he wrote: its culture, in places where it's attractive to others, its political values, when it lives up to them at home and abroad, and its foreign policies, when they're seen as legitimate and having moral authority, unquote. Now, I would go slightly beyond this, and Nye has no objection. I've discussed it with him. A country's soft power, to me, emerges from the world's perceptions of what that country is all about. The associations and attitudes conjured up in the global imagination by the mere mention of a country's name is often a more accurate gauge of its soft power than a dispassionate analysis of its foreign policies. In my view, hard power is exercised, soft power is evoked. Now, for Nye, especially in that first book, the US is the archetypal exponent of soft power. And the fact is that the US is the home of Boeing and Intel, of Google and the iPod, of Microsoft and MTV, Hollywood and Disneyland, McDonald's and Starbucks, in short, of most of the major products that dominate daily life around our globe. The attractiveness of these assets and of the American lifestyle of which they are emblematic is that they permit the US, or they help the US, to persuade others to adopt the US's agenda, rather than relying purely on the dissuasive or coercive hard power of military force. Now, of course, this can cut both ways. In a world of instant mass communications enabled by the internet, countries are increasingly judged by a global public fed on an incessant diet of internet news, televised images, videos taken on the cell phones of passers-by or tourists, email gossip. The steep decline in America's image and standing with the previous administration after 9/11 is a direct reflection of global distaste for the instruments of American hard power. The Iraq invasion, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, torture, rendition, Blackwater's killings of Iraqi civilians. And those inevitably detracted from all the McDonald's, Starbucks, Intel, iPod, the soft power of America. You remember the outpouring of goodwill for Washington in the wake of 9/11. Think of Le Monde's famous assertion, "We are all Americans now." And think of its squandering, really, in the years that followed, by what one might argue was America's over-reliance on hard power in its invasion and occupation of Iraq and the related global war on terror. This is instructive, isn't it? Because the existing soft power assets of the US, which were considerable, as Nye had explained a few years previously, clearly proved inadequate to compensate for the deficiencies of its hard power approach. Fans of American culture were not prepared to overlook the excesses of Guantanamo. Using Microsoft Windows does not necessarily predispose you in favor of extraordinary rendition. The misuse of hard power can undermine your soft power around the world. Now, but this discussion today is not about the US, and I don't want to belabor the point. In fact, in his second book on the subject, The Paradox of American Power, Joseph Nye actually took the analysis of soft power beyond the US. Other nations, too, he suggested, could acquire it. And in today's information era, he wrote, 3 types of countries are likely to gain soft power and so succeed. And as I read this quote from that book, I hope you will think a little bit of India. Those whose quote, those whose dominant cultures and ideals are closer to prevailing global norms, which now emphasize liberalism, pluralism, autonomy, those with the most access to multiple channels of communication and thus have more influence over how issues are framed, and those whose credibility is enhanced by their domestic and international performance, unquote. Now, at first glance, of course, this seems like a prescription for reaffirming the reality of US dominance. Obviously, one could argue that perhaps no other country scores quite as highly in all three categories as the US does. But Nye himself admits that soft power has been pursued by other countries with success over the years. When France lost the war of 1870 to Prussia, one of the most important steps it took to rebuild the nation's shattered morale and to enhance its international prestige was to create the Alliance Française, to promote French language and literature throughout the world as the flagship of France's standing in the globe. French culture has remained a major selling point for French diplomacy ever since. The UK has the British Council, the Swiss have Pro Helvetia, and Germany, Spain, Italy, and Portugal have respectively institutes named for Goethe, Cervantes, Dante Alighieri, and Camus. Today, China has started establishing Confucius institutes to promote Chinese culture internationally. And the Beijing Olympics, as we all know, were a sustained exercise in the building up of soft power by an otherwise hard power-oriented state. The US itself has used officially sponsored initiatives, from the Voice of America to the Fulbright scholarships, to promote its soft power around the world. But soft power does not, in my view, rely merely on governmental action. Arguably for the US, to go back to that example, Hollywood and MTV, which have nothing to do with the government, have done more to promote the idea of America as a desirable and admirable society than any official US governmental endeavor like the VOA or Fulbright. Soft power, in other words, is created partly by governments and partly despite governments, partly by deliberate action, partly by accident. So what does all this mean for India? It means acknowledging that India's claims to any sort of significant leadership role in the world of the 21st century lie, and that is my proposition, in the aspects and products of Indian society and culture that the world might find attractive. These assets may not directly persuade others to support India, but they would go a long way toward enhancing India's intangible standing in the eyes of a globalizing world. Now, the roots of India's soft power run deep. India's is a civilization that over millennia has offered refuge and, more important, religious and cultural freedom to Jews, Parsis, several varieties of Christians, and Muslims. Jews came to the southwestern Indian coast, where my ancestors hail from, Kerala, centuries before Christ. With the destruction by the Babylonians of the first temple and some oral legend, after the destruction by the Romans of the second temple is the other version. And what is not debated, they knew no incident of persecution on Indian soil. In fact, they're probably the only Jewish diaspora in the world that has not known a single incident of anti-Semitism until the Portuguese arrived in the 16th century to inflict it. At that point, in fact, they moved from the bits of Kerala where they were down to Cochin, where they built one of the most magnificent synagogues in the Jewish world. So if I may recommend your next tourist trip, go and have a look at it. It's extraordinary hand-painted mosaics, all in excellent condition. Christianity arrived on Indian soil with St. Thomas the Apostle, Doubting Thomas. In fact, he came to the Malabar coast sometime around before 52 AD and was welcomed on shore, or so oral legend has it, by a flute-playing Jewish girl. I love that image. Now, he made many converts. So there are Indians today whose ancestors were Christian well before anyone of European descent in this room had an ancestor who discovered Christianity. In Kerala, Islam came through traders, travelers, missionaries, rather than by the sword. So it came actually in the Prophet's lifetime, because that Arabian Sea had been traversed many times by people traveling from the peninsula. In fact, the Zamorin of Calicut, ruling the area called Kozhikode in Kerala, was so impressed by the seafaring skills of the Muslims he came across. We had the Kunyali Marikars, who were formidable sailors and naval soldiers, that he actually issued a decree obliging every fisherman in his domain to bring up one son as a Muslim, because he was convinced only Muslims could sail well. And so they had to man his all-Muslim navy. He himself was a Hindu. India, where the wail of the muezzin routinely blends with the chant of mantras at the Hindu temple, and where the tinkling of church bells accompanies the Sikh Gurudwara's reading of verses from the Guru Granth Sahib, is an India that fully embraces the world in all its diversity. Indeed, the British historian E.P. Thompson wrote that this heritage of diversity is what makes India, and I'm quoting here, hasten to assure you, perhaps the most important country for the future of the world. All the convergent influences of the world, Thompson wrote, run through this society. There is not a thought that is being thought in the West or the East that is not active in some Indian mind. Unquote. I'm glad a Brit said that and not an Indian. Now, that Indian mind has been shaped by remarkably diverse forces: ancient Hindu tradition, myth and scripture, the impact of Islam and Christianity, and 2 centuries of British colonial rule, which has given me the language in which I can address you today in Australia. The result is unique. Though there are some who think and speak of India as a Hindu country because it is 81% Hindu, Indian civilization today is an evolved hybrid. We cannot speak of Indian culture today without Qawwali, the poetry of Ghalib, or for that matter, the game of cricket, our de facto national sport, none of which were Hindu in origin, much as Indians have liked to think otherwise about cricket. There's a wonderful Indian sociologist who wrote that cricket is an ancient Indian game accidentally discovered by the British. When an Indian dons national dress for a formal event, he wears a variant of the sherwani which did not exist before the Muslim invasions of northern India. In fact, when Indian Hindus voted a couple of years ago in a cynical and contrived competition to select the new 7 wonders of the modern world, they voted for the Taj Mahal, constructed by a Mughal Muslim king in India, and not for Angkor Wat, the most magnificent architectural product of the Hindu religion, which happens to be in Cambodia. So in the breadth and not just the depth of its cultural heritage lies the roots of India's soft power. Now, one of the only generalizations that can safely be made about India, and of course India is a country about which you can never generalize. So let me generalize by saying nothing can be taken for granted about the country. And not even its name, because as you know, the name India comes from the river Indus, which flows in Pakistan. Well, that anomaly is easily explained, of course, since what is today Pakistan was hacked off the stooped shoulders of India by the departing British in 1947. But I mention this only because Indian nationalism is a very unusual phenomenon indeed. In fact, the UN, we used to joke about, and this is an apocryphal story, about an argument between an American diplomat and a French diplomat at the Security Council. And the American says, you know how we can solve this particular problem? We can do this and this and this, and we can solve it. And the French diplomat says, yes, 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 that will work in practice, but will it work in theory? I'm sure that sounds like some of your political science professors, right? But the thing about Indian nationalism is it works exceedingly well in practice. It's done so now for 64 years, but it doesn't work in terms of any of the theories that underpin the idea of the nation state. It is not based on language. Since our constitution recognizes 23, and there are 35, according to the ethno-linguists, that are spoken by more than 1 million people each. And if you talk about dialects, there are 22,000 dialects. It is not based on geography, the other basis, because the natural geography of the subcontinent, framed by the mountains and the sea, was, as I said, hacked by the partition of 47. It is not based on ethnicity either, the other common thing. At least you could imagine a common ethnic type. Say a German was a recognizable ethnicity till at least a few years and a few guest workers ago. But the fact is that the Indian ethnicity, such as it is, actually accommodates a diversity of racial types. And in fact, if you really get down to it, many Indians have more in common ethnically with foreigners, so-called foreigners, than with other Indians. An Indian Punjabi or an Indian Bengali, for instance, is ethnically kin to a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi, respectively, with whom they have ethnically more in common than with a Poonawalla or a Bangalorean. And as we go through the list of all the ways it doesn't work in theory, it's not based on religion either, because we are home to every faith known to mankind, with the possible exception of Shintoism, though one could argue that point, and Hinduism, which is a faith without a national organization, no established church, no ecclesiastical hierarchy, no Hindu pope, no Hindu Mecca, and no Hindu single sacred book, but many, no uniform beliefs or modes of worship, not even a Hindu Sunday, exemplifies as much our diversity as it does our common cultural heritage. So no, India's nationalism is the nationalism of an idea. The idea of, if I can borrow from Peter Pan, an idea of an ever land, emerging from an ancient civilization, united by a shared history, and above all, I would argue today, sustained by a pluralist democracy. Pluralism is a reality that emerges from the very nature of our country. It's a choice made inevitable by India's geography and reaffirmed by our politics. We are a land of rich diversities. I've observed in the past that we're all minorities in India. Our land imposes no narrow conformities on its citizens. You can be many things and one thing. You can be a good Muslim, a good Keralite, and a good Indian all at once. No contradiction there. Because the idea of India is a one land embracing many. The idea that a nation may endure differences of caste, creed, color, culture, cuisine, conviction, costume, and custom, and still rally around another C, a consensus. And that consensus is a democratic one. It's on the very simple principle that in a richly diverse democracy like ours, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you will agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. Part of the reason I think that India has been able to develop some soft power is that it has survived all the stresses and strains that have beset this extraordinary land. Divisions which led so many outside observers through the 50s and 60s to predict its imminent disintegration, because it managed to manage its diversity by maintaining consensus on how to manage without consensus. And that strength, I'll come back to other aspects of it, remains, in my view, one of the fundamental platforms on which Indian soft power is built. So the world of the 21st century, in my view, will increasingly be a world in which the use of hard power carries with it the odium of mass global public disapproval, whereas the blossoming of soft power, which lends itself far more easily to the information era, will constitute more and more a country's principal asset. Soft power is not about conquering others, but about being yourself. Increasingly, countries are judged by the soft power elements they project onto the world's consciousness, either deliberately, through the export of cultural products, the cultivation of foreign publics, or even international propaganda, but also what they project unwittingly, through the ways in which they are perceived as a result of news stories about them in the global mass media. Now, India, we all know, produces various kinds of culture of varying degrees of quality. Notably, one might add, including the films of Bollywood. Now, I'm a writer, and as a writer, I tend to think of Bollywood through the anecdote of the two goats outside a Bollywood studio. My wife has braved Melbourne traffic to get here, so glad to see her. Two goats at a Bollywood studio chewing away on cans of celluloid discarded by the studio, and the first goat, chewing avidly, says, "You know, this film's not bad." And the second goat says, "Nah, the book was better." So, in my view, the book is always better. But nonetheless, Bollywood has been absolutely a calling card for India. It's reaching ever wider international audiences. Even the triumph of Slumdog Millionaire, which is not a Bollywood movie, but a Western one made in Bombay and with Bollywood production values at the 2009 Oscars, both reflected and reinforced this trend. And this sort of brand of glitzy entertainment that Bollywood represents actually doesn't just appeal to the Indian diaspora in places like the US and the UK, but increasingly around the globe. It's playing on the screens of Syrians and Senegalese. A Senegalese friend told me of his illiterate mother, who takes a bus to the capital city of Dakar every month just to watch a Bollywood film. She can't understand the dialogue. It's in Hindi, right? And she's illiterate, so she can't read the French subtitles. But our films are made to be understood despite such handicaps. She has a great time with all the song and dance and the cavorting around the trees and the action, and she leaves the theatre with stars in her eyes as a result. An Indian diplomat friend in Damascus a decade ago told me that the only posters in that city that were as large, only portraits that were as large as those of the then President Hafez al-Assad, were portraits of the Bollywood superstar Amitabh Bachchan. Indian art, classical music, dance, all have a similar effect. Increasingly, the work of Indian fashion designers are striding across the world's catwalks. Indian cuisine now spreading around the world, has played a part. That's something the French knew before us, of course. The way to foreigners' hearts is through their palates, and the proliferation of Indian restaurants around the world has been little short of astonishing. Yesterday, my wife and I braved jet lag after landing to go down the Yarra Valley, and there we were heading through Healesville in quest of a wine tasting. And what did we find in this tiny little town with population 800 or whatever it is? An Indian restaurant. So this is what we see all over the place. The late British Foreign Secretary, my good friend Robin Cook, when asked what was Britain's national dish, replied with a straight-faced chicken tikka masala. And he was right, because it had actually been invented in Britain. Can I explain how? Small digression, Amitabh, if we have the time. A bunch of drunken British football hooligans, I'm sure you're familiar with the tribe, went to an Indian restaurant and demanded chicken tikka, which was promptly served to them. And then the drunkest of the lot belligerently asked, "Where's the gravy?" Now, for those of you who know chicken tikka, there is no gravy. I'm vegetarian myself, so I'm indifferent to this, but it just comes as two dried pieces of chicken. But these were not people you argued with. So the restaurateur took the chicken tikka back into the kitchen, opened a can of tomato soup, poured it in, heated up the resulting concoction, plunked it on the table and said, "This is chicken tikka masala." They loved it. They kept ordering more. Word spread, and people started going to other Indian restaurants asking for this dish. And thus was chicken tikka masala born in Britain. Look, in England today, in Britain today, Indian restaurants actually employ more people than the iron and steel, shipbuilding, and coal mining industries combined. So the empire can strike back. Now, it's interesting because in this globalizing world, of course, there's always fear, including among some quarters in India, that economic liberalization and globalization will bring with it a sort of cultural imperialism of a particularly insidious kind, that Baywatch and burgers will supplant Bharatnatyam dances and Bhel Puri snacks. But in fact, what India has been able to demonstrate through its experience with Western cultural products in this globalizing world is that we can drink Coca-Cola without becoming Coca-Colonized. Indians have been able to show over the years that they will not become any less Indian if, in Mahatma Gandhi's famous metaphor of 70 years ago, we open the doors and windows of our country and let foreign winds blow through our house. Because Indians are strong enough not to be blown off their own feet by these winds. Our popular culture has proved resilient enough to compete successfully with the seductions of MTV and McDonald's. And the strength of Indianness, and again the source of its soft power, has lain in its ability to absorb foreign influences and to transform them by a peculiarly Indian alchemy into something that belongs naturally on the soil of India, like the language in which I'm addressing you today. Indeed, from the export of Bollywood, Bhangra dances, and so on, India has already demonstrated successfully that it's a player in globalization, not merely a subject of globalization. India has been able to benefit from the future and the past. That is, from the international appeal of its traditional practices, Ayurveda, the science of holistic health, yoga, which, as you know, is accelerating in popularity across the globe, as well as the future ideas, the transformed image of the country created by its thriving diaspora. When I first went to the States as a graduate student in 1975, the image of India in most Americans' minds was obviously of starving mendicants with begging bowls, or naked fakirs lying on beds of nails, or perhaps somebody climbing up an invisible rope without the famous rope trick, the Indian rope trick. At best, the rare case of the Maharaja on a caparisoned elephant. But that was about it, right? Today, the image has changed drastically, principally because of the contribution that information technology has been able to make to India's soft power. Because when Americans in Silicon Valley now speak of the Indian Institutes of Technology, the IITs, with the same reverence that they only used to accord to MIT, the Indianness of engineers and software developers is now taken as synonymous with mathematical and scientific excellence. As a result, it's India that gains in respect. Now, sometimes this has unintended consequences. You know, I met an Indian the other day who, rather like Amitabh and me, has only studied history and international politics or whatever. He was transiting through Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, and he was accosted by an anxiously perspiring European saying, "You're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop?" I mean, the old Indian stereotype has now been replaced by a new stereotype in which every Indian must be a software guru or a computer geek. But India's success in an area that matters to the world of the 21st century is a reflection of the country's increasing aptitude at becoming a global player. The small budget Tata Nano car, for example, though considered a domestic marketing disaster in India, was a triumph of no-frills engineering to world-class standards and took the Geneva Auto Salon by storm. If that's not enough, if small cars are not your thing, Tata's acquisition of Jaguar means that British ambassadors across the world now drive around in an Indian car. That may not be enough to send a post-colonial frisson down most Australian spines. How about this? When Jamshedji Tata tried, in the teeth of British opposition, to set up a steel factory at the beginning of the 20th century, a colonial official of the day sneered that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. It's a pity he didn't live to see the day that a descendant of the same Jamshedji Tata bought the remains of British steel by acquiring Chorus 5 years ago. It might have given him a bad case of indigestion. What's more, Tata has turned the loss-making Chorus and Jaguar plants around, showcasing the excellence of Indian managerial capacities in today's sophisticated global business environment. That's a story, too, that India can tell. And as my friend Joseph Nye has argued, in the information age, it's not really the biggest army that matters. It's the side which has the better story, which can tell the better story that wins. India is, I would argue, increasingly, and with all the evidence I've given you, the land of the better story. It's a society with a free press, even if some politicians think it's almost too free, and a thriving mass media, where the people whose creative energies are daily encouraged to express themselves in a variety of appealing ways. And as a result, India has an extraordinary ability to tell stories that are more persuasive and attractive than those of its rivals. Now, this is not about propaganda. Indeed, I would argue it will not work if it is directed from above, least of all by my government. I'm not at all suggesting that propaganda is the way. The impact of the stories that are told without the government's involvement can actually be huge, however intangible they may be. I'll give you one concrete example. Afghanistan, crucial country for our national security, yours and certainly India's. We know about President Obama's surge in Afghanistan, all of that stuff in recent years. But you know the most interesting asset for India in Afghanistan till last year? Actually, it never came out of a military mission. We don't have a military mission in Afghanistan. It comes instead from one simple fact. Till just about a year ago, you could not telephone an Afghan at 8:30 in the evening. Why? Because that was when the Indian television soap opera, Kyunki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi, dubbed into the Dari language, was telecast on Tolo TV. And no one wished to miss it. It was reportedly the most popular show in Afghan television history, at least until the onset of Afghan Idol sometime this year, I think. It's considered, in fact, there was a rough estimate that 92% of all television sets in Afghanistan were tuned to this one show. It was considered directly responsible for a spike in the sale of generator sets, so people wouldn't have to miss the show because of a power outage, and even for absences from religious functions, which clashed with its broadcast times, which is why the mullahs started going after it in Afghanistan. While it was on, this show, Saas, so thoroughly captured the public imagination that in this deeply conservative Islamic country, where family problems are normally hidden behind the veil, quite literally, it was an Indian TV show that came to dominate society's discussion of family issues. I've actually read reports of wedding banquets being interrupted so that the guests could huddle around the TV for half an hour before returning their attention to the bride and groom. And even of a measurable increase in crime at 8:30 p.m. in Afghanistan because the watchman was sneaking a look at the TV instead of minding the store. One Reuters dispatch, I'm not quoting the Press Trust of India, a British news agency, recounted how robbers in Mazar-e-Sharif, this was a couple of summers ago, stripped a vehicle of every detachable part, its windshield wipers, its hubcaps, its side view mirrors, you name it, during the telecast time, and then scrawled on the car in an allusion to the show's heroine, Tulsi Zindabad, long live Tulsi, the heroine of the show. That's soft power, and India doesn't even have to thank the government for its exercise. Instead, Indians too can simply say, Tulsi Zindabad. Now, that is not an endorsement since the show is now over, but nonetheless, it's an example of what I'm talking about. Now, I'm not denying that official government policy can also play a role. My friend Pavan Verma, the former head of the Indian Council on Cultural Relations, used to argue that culturally India is a superpower and that cultural diplomacy must be pursued for political ends. As a result of that sort of approach, India is very visible at cultural shows around the world. We are festivals of India organized in assorted cities, and ICCR is rather good at that. But I personally think there's a limit to how far that can go because most people tend to see propaganda for what it is. I believe the message that really gets through is of who we are, not what we want to show. So what we showcase has some but limited value. Who we are, not what we can deliberately and consciously exhibit or put on display, but how others see who we are, that I think is important whether or not we're trying to show it to the world. I'll give you a different example. Politically, of course I have a political point of view myself on all of this, but when this happened, I was not in India or in politics. In May 2004, I was traveling through the Arab world for the United Nations when India's election results came out. As you know, every Indian election is immediately the world's largest exercise in democratic franchise. And that was it until record was broken 5 years later and will be broken whenever the next election is. But in any case, in 2004, the election was won by a political leader of Italian descent and Roman Catholic heritage, who then made way for a Sikh to be sworn in as prime minister by a Muslim president in a country 81% Hindu. And the admiration that was expressed to me by my senior interlocutors in these Arab countries could not have possibly been more gratifying. And it was nothing to do with India trying to send a message to the world. It was simply India being itself. So it's not just material accomplishments that can enhance India's soft power. Even more important, arguably, are the values and principles for which India stands, the diversity exemplified in that anecdote. One could argue that Mahatma Gandhi won India its independence through the use of soft power, because nonviolence and satyagraha were indeed classic uses of soft power and moral force, attractive values, before the term was even coined. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was also a skilled exponent of soft power. He developed a role for India in the world based entirely on its civilizational history, such as what I've talked to you about earlier today, and its moral standing, making India very consciously the voice of the oppressed and the marginalized against the big power hegemons of the day. This gave India enormous standing and prestige across the world for some years, and arguably strengthened our own self-respect as we stood proud and independent on the world stage. But there was a great flaw in Nehru's approach, which was that his soft power was unrelated to any acquisition of hard power. And as the humiliation of the military defeat by China in 1962 demonstrated, soft power has crippling limitations in national security terms. Instead of Theodore Roosevelt's maxim, speak softly and carry a big stick, our India spoke loudly but had no stick at all. And in a tough neighborhood, the rhetoric of peace can only take you so far. Soft power becomes credible when there is hard power behind it. That is why I would argue the US has been able to make so much of its soft power. Recent Indian history offers a somewhat mixed picture when it comes to the effective use of hard power. And I will have to acknowledge that because otherwise some of you will undoubtedly berate me about it during the Q&A session to follow. The 1971 war with Pakistan, leading to the emergence of Bangladesh, remains the preeminent example of India's use of hard power. But there are a few others. The repelling of Pakistani intruders from the Kargil Heights in 1999, and a swift paratroop intervention in the Maldives to reverse a coup against the then president provided rare instances of hard power success. Against these examples were the 1962 China War I mentioned, the spectacular failures of the Indian peacekeeping force in Sri Lanka in '87, which withdrew after incurring heavy casualties in an unplanned war with Tamil insurgents, the hijacking of an Indian Airlines aircraft to Kandahar in 1999, resulting in the craven release of detained terrorists from Indian jails, the repeated bleeding of the country through terrorist incidents planned and directed from Pakistan, and innumerable other unprovoked incidents involving Indian loss of life. India is often caught in a cleft stick on such matters. It often treads softly in its anxiety not to come across as a regional bully, and in so doing, it emboldens those who are prepared to test it. As a result, it has been noticeably reluctant to evolve a strategic doctrine based on hard power. There is still a sense in which most Indians think that that would be unseemly. But that may help buttress my case for a growing consciousness of India's soft power. I'm not arguing that hard power will become irrelevant, merely that its limitations are also apparent, whereas soft power, despite the limitations I've acknowledged, lasts longer and has a wider, more self-reinforcing reach. For China and Russia, for example, kung fu movies or the Bolshoi Ballet will win more admirers internationally than the People's Liberation Army or Siberian oil reserves, even if in each case the latter is what the state relies upon. But of course New Delhi knows that soft power cannot solve its security challenges. After all, an Islamist terrorist who enjoys a Bollywood movie will still have no compunction about setting off a bomb in a Delhi bazaar. And the US has already learned that the perpetrators of 9/11 ate their last dinner at a McDonald's. To counter a threat like terrorism, there is no substitute for hard power. I don't know if you checked Twitter today, Amitabh. I took a quick look on the way down, and you had tweeted that I'd be speaking about soft power, and you got an impertinent response from a right-wing person on Twitter saying, yes, you can talk about India's softness in the face of other people's power, or words to that effect. But the fact is, that's not what we're saying, and I want to make that very clear to those who believe that soft power is being advocated as a substitute for hard power. It is not. Hard power without soft power, though, stirs up resentments and enmities, just as soft power without hard power is a confession of weakness. Yet hard power tends to work better domestically than internationally. An autocratic state is not bothered with having to tell a better story to its own people, but without one, it has little with which to purchase the goodwill of the rest of the world. Whether it's the Americans in Guantanamo, the Chinese in Tibet, or the Russians in Georgia, it can in each case be said that a major military power won the hard power battle and lost the soft power war. Where soft power works in security terms, therefore, is in attracting enough goodwill from ordinary people to reduce the sources of support and succor that the terrorists enjoy, and without which they cannot function. But this means that India also has to solve its internal problems before it can play any role of leadership in the world. As I said at the very beginning, we must ensure that we do enough to keep our people healthy, well-fed, and secure, not just from jihadi terrorism, but from the daily terror of poverty, hunger, and ill health. Progress is being made. India can take satisfaction from its success in carrying out three kinds of revolutions in feeding its people: the green revolution in food grains, the white revolution in milk production, and at least to some degree a blue revolution in the development of our fisheries. But the benefits of these revolutions have not yet fully reached the nearly third of our population still living below the poverty line. And we know we must do that, or our soft power will ring hollow, both at home and abroad. And at the same time, if India wants to be a source of attraction to others, it must not only fulfill these basic requirements, it must preserve the precious pluralism that is such a civilizational asset in our globalizing world. Our democracy, our free media, our contentious civil society forums, our energetic human rights groups, and the repeated spectacle of our remarkable general elections have all made of India a rare example of the successful management of diversity and political difference in the developing world. It seems to me it adds to India's soft power, does not subtract from it, when our non-governmental organizations actively defend human rights, promote environmentalism, fight injustice, or agitate against corruption. It's a vital asset that our media, for all its irresponsibility, and my God it's irresponsible, is at least free, lively, irreverent, and disdainful of sacred cows. But every time that there are reports of negatives from India, we know, and I know the Australian media went to town on the Commonwealth Games, for example. When there are negative stories, which we obviously ourselves generate in a free society, we know that tarnishes our soft power. So the solution lies in getting things right, in not just doing the right thing, but doing the thing right. And if we do that, I believe that an India which proudly reflects all these qualities I've described to you, stands for the multi-religious identities of our people, our linguistic diversity, our cultural talent, the myriad manifestations of our creative energies. All of this will be an India that maintains its soft power and its true heritage in the eyes of the world. I really have taken a little longer than I intended to, so I am going to try and wrap it up right here so that we can have an exchange to follow right away. I would essentially end with the idea that the changes that have been taking place in India, and I'm happy to address them in the Q&A, I've skipped a couple of additional points since we're getting perilously close to the end of my allotted time. The revolution that has been taking place in India, it really is little short of that, a revolution in our politics, in our economics, in our society, and in our social practices like our caste relations. All of this is fundamentally worthwhile because it's a democratic revolution sustained by a larger idea of India, an idea that safeguards the common space available to each Indian identity, an India that celebrates diversity. I loved saying in America that if you in America are a melting pot, we're not. We manage somehow to preserve all these different identities still. We are instead a thali. I don't know how many of you have been to an Indian restaurant like the ones I talked about. A thali is a large, often stainless steel plate with a number of bowls in it. Each one contains a different dish, and because each is in a different bowl, it doesn't necessarily flow into the next. But they all belong together on the same plate, and they combine together on your palate to give you a satisfying repast. That is India. That is India to me, and that civilizational ethos, in my mind, has been an immeasurable asset for our country. It's essential that India doesn't allow the negative forces that are prevalent in our society and in our politics to undermine this great asset, the soft power, which is our great strength in the 21st century. I should have said, since we are in front of a university audience and you'll be looking to all of this quite seriously, that I would argue that there should be a more systematic development and leveraging of a soft power strategy than India currently has or does. Such strategic advantages have occurred so far from India's soft power. Goodwill for the country amongst African, Arab, and Afghan publics, for example. I can't tell you how many African foreign ministers and even heads of government told me that the one thing they looked forward to in growing up in their countries was the arrival of the Bollywood movie in the nearest theatre. All of that has been really largely an unplanned byproduct of these normal emanations of Indian culture. This goodwill has not been systematically harnessed as a strategic asset by New Delhi. I'm not sure if our High Commissioner will disagree with me. It's perhaps changing in recent years, but certainly not for a very long time did we make a conscious effort to harness this. It's ironic that in and around the 2008 Olympics, authoritarian China showed a greater determination to use its hard power strengths to cultivate a soft power strategy for itself on the world stage. I would argue that India need not try as hard, but it will need to do more than it currently does to leverage that natural soft power asset into a viable and valuable instrument of its global strategy. I want to stress again, so that we can eliminate that line of questioning from the Q&A, that hard power will continue to have its place in our world. Nonetheless, the world's respect will no longer be accorded merely to the strongest and richest countries. Those who tell the most persuasive stories, and those about whom the most positive stories are told, will fare better in the world public's reckoning than those who win the wars. But remember, the better story is not merely the story that can be told. It is a story that is heard and seen and repeated whether or not you're trying to tell it and whether or not you're trying to sell it. I believe that the India that has entered its 7th decade as an independent country now is one that's open to the contention of ideas and interests within it, that's unafraid of the prowess or the products of the outside world, that's wedded to the democratic pluralism which is its greatest strength, and that is determined to liberate and fulfill the creative energies of its people, and of course to beat Australia at cricket this coming summer. Such an India will tell stories the rest of the world wants to hear and is glad to repeat, and that will offer it an inestimable advantage in the global mass media of our information age. Such an India, which I think is not an unduly rosy depiction of today's India, truly enjoys soft power, and that may well be the most valuable way in which it can offer some leadership to the 21st century world. Thank you, and Jai Hind. Stand here and take questions? I might
Well, we're fortunate to have the speaker being prepared to answer questions and without any qualifications as to the form of question, I understand. So it's open to the audience now to ask questions. Yes. There's a microphone. Would you just take the microphone? It might be easier. And it might be
helpful to identify themselves.
Perhaps you can state your name and
your
area of interest.
Well, I'm very interested in India's future. It seems to be the best sort of soft power that it could exercise would be leadership with regards to sustainability and caring for the environment. Because if the water runs out, India can't exercise any kind of power at all. And I'm very concerned as to how an environmental consciousness could be developed through education and other means.
Thank you. Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not sure who I'm looking at because all I can see is this bright light shining in my eyes. But I do agree with the thrust of that question, and I'm pleased to say that though we were a bit late, I think, in waking up to the dangers of the environment for ourselves, we really are now making a systematic effort to improve environmental consciousness in two important ways. First, through education. Every school, every college runs environmental programs in their courses of study, in their extracurriculars. There's green runs, there's green campaigns. There is no school child coming out of any school in India who is not now environmentally conscious. But secondly, in the political arena, we have an environment ministry with real teeth. And no project, not even a development project, can actually be approved to be executed without environmental clearance. This has been an enormous source of frustration to many in India who are impatient with the pace of our growth and who want us to do things that without the restraints that China never imposed upon itself when it grew. But for example, a $5 billion steel plant in Orissa has now been held up for 7 years because of a succession of objections from the Environment Ministry. In China, that plant would have already been capturing a quarter of the world market. But this is India, and it shows that there is now very, very serious respect for democracy and for the environment in our system.
There's a gentleman on the aisle. Would you mind standing up, please, so we can see you?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Ashutosh Mishra. I come from Griffith University in Brisbane. Dr. Tharoor, brilliant oration.
Thank you.
And I must confess, this is the first time I haven't gone to sleep in an oration. You talked about how India's soft power has traveled the world over. You referred to Kyunki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi. You talked about Bollywood and how government had nothing to do with it. And then you also talked about how various countries have got various government initiatives, institutes world over to promote soft power. Now my point is that would you agree that the government here has to be a bit cautious how it promotes soft power so that it doesn't sell it rather than telling the story of India, and it has to use just the right amount of power like in billiards, neither too much, not too less, just the right amount, otherwise it becomes like a propaganda. Thank you.
No, I agree with you. That's a fine metaphor, actually. I should start incorporating it into future iterations of this argument. Just like billiards, not too much and not too little. Thank you.
Yes, the gentleman holding his hand up in the middle with the red tone.
Mr. Tharoor, I'm a big fan of yours, so thank you once again.
Thank you.
For an excellent tale. Your cricketing skills are as good as your ability to spin a tale. But if you permit me to be a little provocative, the underlying thesis of your talk is about a unified, dominant, emerging India, despite all the plurality and diversity. But could I put to you an alternative view that, in fact, that very diversity was, in fact, leading to an inevitable fragmentation and fraying and almost balkanization of India, and perhaps only the massive economic progress made in the last 2 decades has perhaps arrested that coalition stalemate politics that we had seen happening in the 80s and the sort of decay of the standards of parliamentary democracy. What do you think of that view, that it was really only the economic progress that has arrested that inevitable decline? And secondly, if that thesis has got some legs, what do you think about the prospects of India actually being able to maintain that economic momentum in these very troubled waters that we see?
Right. No, I'm intrigued by your advancing the thesis because it's woefully out of date. I mean, there was, let's face it, in 47, what do we have? We had a country that was fragmented into X number of British provinces, 9 I think it was, and 542 princely states. That was a patchwork of different kinds of rules, systems, traditions, languages, that was riven by the bloodshed of partition, the flames of communal carnage blazing across the land. If India had to disintegrate, that was the time. I mean, it really was the most unpropitious start that one can imagine any new nation having in the last 60 years. I cannot imagine a country that came to birth in worse circumstances than India. And yet, the great statesmen of that era, notably Jawaharlal Nehru, chose democracy as a means of knitting the nation together. Had he gone the other way, had he tried some form of autocracy, saying it was only by force that the nation could have been held together, who knows whether your dire prediction might indeed have worked out in the 40s or 50s. But through democracy, he achieved one very simple thing. He basically let everybody from all sorts of backgrounds, regions, languages, religions, castes, feel they had an equal stake in the success of this adventure. And really is an adventure, one in which almost anything is possible. Don't forget that for the first 4 decades and a half of India's independence, we grew at the so-called Hindu rate of growth, the 3% that Raj Krishna, the economist, dismissed with that description. There was no real economic progress, and yet there were all these divisions, and the nation hadn't yet had a chance to knit itself together. There were huge differences from one part of the country to the next. There wasn't even mass television to bring images of other parts of India to the eyeballs of people in different parts of India. And yet, despite poor economic growth, despite that, the idea of India held. And I think it held together principally because of the framework of democracy that Nehru had sustained. I'm sorry if I'm sounding too much like Manish Shankaraya, perish the thought. But it did. And the fact is that since then, more things have knit us together than have pulled us apart. Yes, there are sort of, these states have all acquired significant identities of their own, but they've all felt secure in their regional identities because they see themselves as part of this larger identity. The carapace of the Indian identity has actually paradoxically made it possible to assert smaller identities with ever greater confidence, knowing that that assertion no longer threatens the national ideal. When there were expressions of Tamil nationalism in the early 60s, there was real fear that Tamil Nadu might even consider secession. Today, they speak of Tamil pride, and it's just part of it's like really no more threatening to the unity of India than pride in Victoria. And this, I suppose, this coming rugby final between 2 Victorian teams, so the governor will not have to choose. But I'm just saying, there's nothing much more than that. Oh, I said rugby. I should have said Australian rules football. My apologies. But any game whose acronym abbreviation is ARF has some limitation, surely. I'm sorry, I'm being sacrilegious, I know. So my argument in any case for our questioner is that economic growth was actually the icing on the cake. It came later. Mass communications has also knit the country together. The ease of travel, the fungibility of jobs, the increasing migrations, increasing intermarriages in the cities. All of these things have made India far more united and not less than it was in the 50s and 60s. And so even at the risk of some complacency, I would say that the fear you express of balkanization or disintegration is at least 30 or 40 years out of date. And I speak, by the way, as a Keralite married to a Kashmiri, so.
Yes, there's a lady sitting with the glasses on with a hand up.
Thank you. My name is Radhika. I'm from the University of Melbourne. Thank you, Shashi, for this outstanding talk. As a diasporic Indian, I sat there swelling with pride at the picture of India you painted, but also at the Indian that was painting such a picture. India has presented a number of icons and images that are really charming and attractive. But lately, I fear that I've seen another, a glimmer of India the brat. And I think this came through in cricket, and I have to say in Sydney here a couple of years ago. I'm wondering what you think of this. Is there a danger that our very success and this glare of the world looking at us as a superpower, as you know, etc., is going to lead to diminishing our soft power through encouraging this kind of bratishness in our behavior?
It's a difficult one to answer, certainly, because, of course, one could argue that to some degree, India is simply going to have to get better at being what it is in order to sustain enhanced scrutiny. We're going to have to be prepared for that. There are brats and louts in every society. I dare say Australia is not exempt. And if indeed some of our brats and louts have shown that misbehavior, as you suggest they have, then that doesn't reflect well in India. But does it undermine the very good work done by other Indians in the same space? I mean, if you're referring to incidents in Australia a couple of years ago, what do we have? I think the High Commissioner was telling me over 500,000 Indians in Australia. How many of them would you lump together in this negative category, and how many have made a valuable, positive, upstanding contribution both to Australia and to India's image in Australia as successful Indians here? I think that while you're right to be conscious of negatives, and I'm one person in my life who's never allowed myself to sink into complacency about anything I've ever done or any argument I've ever advanced, I still think that one shouldn't just see the negative when there is so much positive out there. It reminds me of a story Kofi Annan liked to tell, my old boss at the UN, about his school days in Ghana when a professor came in with a large white sheet that he put up that had a small black dot in it. And he said to the students, "So what do you see?" And every student very cleverly put up his hand and said, "The black dot." And he said, the professor turned to the students and said, "So you see the black dot. What about this vast expanse of white sheet all the way around it? Why must you only focus on the aberration? Why must you only focus on the negative?" It's a story I would love to tell the Indian media one day, but certainly for you too. There are positives, and we can focus on.
There's a gentleman here in the front.
I'm Neil Nanda from South Asia Times, which is a small newspaper published in Melbourne. I just said very small, from this very stage, Mr. Manishankar IS gave us a very beautiful presentation. And he concluded that India is developing, but not Indians. So what is your reaction to that?
Well, not having heard his speech, it would be wrong for me to comment on a sentence from it. So I'm going to pass on that one. I obviously would not have expressed such a thought myself, but since I don't know the argumentation that led to it, it would be wrong of me to react.
The gentleman right here in about the third or fourth row in the middle. I think there's a microphone that's coming in.
This Indian is developing in all the wrong places, I'm afraid, so I have particular affinity to that.
I'm Dr. Gurjeet Parora. I'm in Australia for the last 35 years, and my information is based on what I read in the newspapers and television. It may not be. Democracy is the best of the worst form of governments. And if I make a statement that democracy has failed India, because democracy has allowed people with dubious characters, who have come into governance both in the central and state governments, who have failed 1/3 or 1/4 of the population, who still continue to live below the poverty line and have done so for generations. And having visited villages and doing some voluntary work, probably in the last 30 years, I have seen nothing change. And I've put this down to bad governance And probably the democracy has allowed people to come in who are not properly fit to govern. I would like to have your comments. Thank you.
Well, a cliche I regret I've stopped using, I first said it 25 years ago, so I got tired of saying it, is that everything you can say about India, the opposite is also true. So the fact is that what you have seen, and I'm not asking you to disbelieve the evidence of your eyes, is one aspect of India's reality, but I've also seen the opposite, of enormous change and transformation. If you read my book, India from Midnight to the Millennium, I have a sort of narrative account of changes in my Kerala village that I saw with my own eyes while growing up and visiting that village over the short span of my own childhood. There are places where change has been great. There have been places where change has been slower to come. There are places that are well administered. There are places that are badly governed. There are places that have gone from one to the other. And Bihar might be in the process of doing both, having gone from well-governed to badly administered, and now going back to well-governed again. So there are always these narratives in India that head in every direction. I would not agree with faulting democracy for it. Because, as I said, democracy is the best system to keep a widely diverse country like ours together. It's the only system that gives everyone an equal stake and equal opportunity in it. And therefore, there is no one who has an incentive, or very few who have an incentive, to, for example, try and break away. And when they do try, they are very quickly co-opted by the ballot box rather than by the bullet. And in many of our secessionist insurgencies, for example, yesterday's secessionists become today's chief ministers and leaders of the opposition tomorrow, that being the vagaries of democratic politics. So democracy to me is indispensable. I don't think India can be governed in any other way but by democracy, given the nature of our people and given the nature of our nation. But if you're saying that we have not entirely succeeded in solving all our problems, I said that myself. I agree entirely with you. You speak of poverty. It's true that we have managed to pull about 10 million people out of poverty a year in the last decade. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh confirmed that figure this week. Now, 10 million is not a lot in a country of 1.2 billion, but it's still 1% almost of the population. And that's a very slow rate of progress, because China has pulled out, God knows, 420 million people out of poverty in the last 2 decades. But if you grow at that sort of breakneck speed, you can only do it by breaking some necks. And in a democracy, you don't do that. In a democracy, you won't do that. So it's a trade-off. You may be right that democracy has in some respects been less efficient, that some of our progress in overcoming the age-old challenges of poverty and discrimination and other difficulties, that some of this progress has been slower than you would like. But I have to say that I still think that in the balance between, as I said, doing the right thing and doing the thing right, democracy is the way of doing the thing right. We still have to do the right thing. We have to struggle. We can't afford to give up. But some progress has been made, and we can make more through the way we do things in India.
Dr. Thur's fascinating oration has obviously raised a number of issues that are associated with these topics, and it's a fascinating evening, and I think we can spend all night here speaking, but unfortunately, all good things come to an end. There are 2 more questions, and there's a gentleman right at the end of that row.
I'm Ajay Raina, and thank you for bringing up the IITs, because I have that as my lineage, both as a student, as an academic. And
I mentioned the Kashmiri too, Mr. Raina.
Oh yes, thanks, that too.
2 flowers to you.
Thank you very much for that. And I want to know about something very different from what's going on from the narrative. That is, both the countries, India, where I was born and where I grew up, and Australia, which is my adopted home, primarily can only play within the soft power space. Primarily, I'm not saying that. Your tenure, your term at the United Nations as the Under-Secretary General, I would like to ask you, using that experience, is there space enough, and is there space readily available at the Security Council for permanent membership for both these countries, or either of these countries, and if so, how soon? Thank you.
Well, I do think India's credentials for permanent membership are very impressive. I will not comment on Australia. But when the permanent membership category was invented in 1945, the idea was to give a guaranteed stake in the institution to the big powers of the day, without whom the institution would lack credibility. Don't forget, they had the experience of the previous 2 decades of the League of Nations, which lost the ability to influence some of the major countries in the world, either because they chose not to belong, like the US, or because they were expelled from it, like Germany and later Russia and Italy. So if the big powers were not in the League had no capacity to influence them. So they said the UN must ensure that the big powers of our times had a stake and therefore would remain and would not work outside the scope of the UN, would not abandon it. This is why the permanent membership category was created, why the veto was given, and of course the 5 big powers of the day. In fact, China sort of barely squeezed into that category because it had not really won its war by itself, and even the French, one might debate to what degree they were victors of World War II until very late in the day. But having said all of this, these were the 5 big powers. France was a major colonial power, so was Britain, an empire. Obviously, the Russians and the Americans, the 2 big countries, and the Chinese, as I said, squeaked in as well at that point. There was no credible argument for anyone else. Today, it's difficult to argue that these people deserve to be there indefinitely because of a war they happened to win 6.5 decades ago. And so, increasingly, the demand has arisen, should we not have a Security Council that reflects the stake that we need to see in this institution by the big powers of today? And of course, it's a non-threatening approach. No one's trying to unseat any of the existing powers, but merely to add to them. And a convincing argument can be made for many countries, of which India is certainly, we would argue, an obvious contender. As I said, soon to be the largest country in the world in terms of population, soon to be the 3rd largest economy in the world in terms of PPP, already a major contributor to UN peacekeeping, to UN other activities, the Democracy Fund, all sorts of things. A nation, in other words, with some weight already proven over the years in the UN, and therefore deserving a place at the high table. The problem is, of course, that finding a formula by which the Council can be reformed has proved quite intractable. I remember back in 1992, the then Secretary General Boutros Ghali saying that he expected that Security Council reform would be sort of done and dusted in time for the 50th anniversary of the United Nations in 1995. The 65th has gone by, and if we allow this process to continue with indefinite talking, they might well usher in the UN centenary without a change, and that would be bad for the UN because it would lack credibility. If you look at the figures, for example, when the Security Council was established, there were 11 members out of a total UN membership of 51. So 22% of the UN was in the Security Council. Today, there's 15 out of a total UN membership of 193, less than 8%. So more countries, both in absolute numbers and in percentages, feel underrepresented or unrepresented in the Security Council. Europe, with 5% of the world's population, has 33% of the Council seats in any given year, including, as we know, 3 of the 5 permanent members. These are all anomalous issues, and it's going to be difficult to sustain an argument to persist with this. But how do you actually find a formula? The initial argument was made in the mid-90s for Japan and Germany, then the 2nd and 3rd largest contributors financially to the UN. But they're dismissed in the UN Charter as enemy states, because the UN was the World War II alliance that converting itself into a peacetime organization. Now, if Japan and Germany are brought in, what about the developing world? What about countries from the global south? And then people say, well, we'll have to have 1 from Asia, 1 from Latin America, perhaps 2 from Africa, since there are 54 African countries and none of them is in the Council. And then that debate started, because for every country that was considered a logical aspirant, there were others prepared to contest the logic. So India's claims, I won't give you any prizes for guessing who's not happy with India's claims to a permanent seat. Brazil has raised questions in both Mexico and Argentina, including on the basis that they don't speak the language that the other countries of Latin America speak. How can they be the sole Latin Americans' permanent seat? And in Africa, how do you manage to adjudicate amongst the competing claims of the largest democracy, Nigeria, the largest economy, South Africa, and the oldest civilization, Egypt? So all of these things have created a certain ferment in the organization. It's been difficult to agree. Even Germany's credentials have been challenged by Italy, which rather famously said at one point, what's all this talk about Germany and Japan? After all, we lost the war too. So with all of this happening, and you do need, at the UN, a 2/3 majority, in the General Assembly, that's 128 countries out of 193 to vote for an amendment, and then that's got to be ratified by the parliaments of 2/3 of the members, including those of all 5 permanent members, the current ones. So you need a formula that is simultaneously acceptable to 2/3 of the world and is not unacceptable to political opinion in the 5 countries whose powers you're trying to dilute. It's so far proved a tall order, but we ain't giving up.
It's a bit like the referendums in Australia, Dr. Thoreau.
I can imagine, yes.
There's a lady in the... There's the last question. Ladies here in the front.
I don't mind if you want to come. I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Mr. Shashi Tharoor, for an interesting talk.
Thank you.
It was better than reading Romila Thapa's history book. I have 2 questions. One is, you said China's soft selling power is Confucius. India's is broad. You talk to so many things. India's soft power ranges from Bollywood to history to politics to everything. Have you given a brand name to India's soft selling power? And 2, you worked for 3 decades in the United Nations and now you're a politician. Which role do you enjoy more?
Oh my gosh. No brand names. You know, there was actually an attempt made by India to actually create a sort of brand identity for itself at Davos. And they came up with a rather cumbersome world's fastest growing free market democracy, which I guess we are, but it doesn't quite sort of trip off the tongue like it's better in the Bermuda, in the Bahamas or whatever. So I'm not sure we have a brand name or a catchy slogan. But in fact, the tourism department came closest to it, I think. Incredible India. My argument, of course, is that in addition to being incredible India, I want us to be credible India too. And that's important. So, as for the UN and politics, all I can say is these are different worlds. I try not to look back. I had a wonderful and I hope meaningful 29 years of the United Nations system. I worked for refugees. I worked in peacekeeping. I really felt very often that I could put my head to the pillow at night, knowing that things I'd done had made a real difference to human beings' lives. And I'm trying to do the same thing in politics. It's too early for me to say whether I've got there yet. Thank you very much for asking.
As we come to the end of this evening's function, it gives me great pleasure to thank His Excellency Alex Chernow, the Governor of Victoria and the patron of the Australia-India Institute, for so graciously agreeing to chair this oration and for doing so admirably. Thank you, Governor. And it's an equally great pleasure to thank Dr. Shashi Tharoor for his masterly oration this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the distinguished guests.